it should be widely understood that the U.S. and Germany had explicitly promised Gorbachev and Yeltsin that NATO would not move 1 inch eastward in 1990. If people think that that is, pro-Putin propaganda, they should look at what's called the National Security Archive of George Washington University to get all the documentation. This was repeated time and again. Now, this is what happened in the European sphere: expand NATO to the east, get out of the anti-ballistic missile treaty, put in new anti-ballistic missiles in Central and Eastern Europe, notably in Poland and Romania to this point, insist that the U.S. can go wherever it wants in this alliance, up to and including the 2,100-kilometer Ukraine-Russia border, and including the eastern Black Sea, which to my mind is mind-boggling to think that Georgia is a North Atlantic state that should be a member of NATO. Now, in the Asia-Pacific region, this was of lesser concern to American policymakers until around 2010, because the U.S. just thought that China was a bunch of rice-growing villages, that it was poor, that it would assemble U.S. iPhones and whatever, but that it was not of any significance. And it finally dawned on these geniuses in the U.S. security state sometime around 2010 that China was becoming a great success economically and technologically. Now, my view as an economist was a great success. Hooray! Good for the Chinese people, good for the world economy, good for global prosperity. But from a us versus them perspective, which I, of course, don't share, of the U.S. security state, suddenly China became a dire threat. And starting around 2014, a new doctrine of containing China was adopted by the U.S. Officialdom, and this has transcended now Obama, Trump, and Biden. One basic point I should mention is that while the discourse is about Trump versus Biden or partisan politics, what we're observing in Europe, in the Middle East, and in East Asia is not partisan politics. It is a deep state U.S. strategy. This is different. That's, by the way, not crazy conspiracy talk. That just means that there is a national strategy which transcends a particular administration. And we have these organizations, especially the CIA, the intelligence community, the Pentagon, the weapons contractors that have a time horizon that's longer term than a political cycle.
I just had a conversation with Matthias Döpfner. He's the chief of the Springer Company. He's at the board of directors of Netflix. He's the owner of Politico. And his newspapers are strongly advocating Western resistance towards Eastern despotism. I mean, we had a conversation about that. This is an argument you hear also in Switzerland. They say, well, you know, China is a threat. They are undergoing, they're like evading the WTO rules. We have Russia, which is an autocracy. And there is a sense, and I think it's an authentic sense with these voices, that somehow our way of life, our democracy is threatened. Therefore, we have to contain for these countries, these powers. What are you? I'm sure you're confronted with this argument as well. What do you counter in this sense? What's your answer to that?
Well, first of all, it's a meme or a theme that goes back to Herodotus in the Greek-Persian Wars. It's a theme since Alexander and the Hellenistic empires that he created. It is a theme of the Roman Empire in its battles with the Parthians, with the Persians that went on for several centuries. It is a theme during the Crusades and the infidels to the East It is a theme that was part and parcel of the rhetoric of the British Empire, and it was a theme of the Enlightenment, Asian despotism, Western values. It's extraordinarily trite, is what it is. It is trite. It is simple-minded.
Is it paranoia?
It is ignorance, basically. People should go out and go to China, make some friends, have some Chinese students, go to Moscow, go to other places in the world. This us versus them mentality is kind of a primitive. Maybe it's a basic psychological state. Evolutionary biologists think that because small bands competed with each other over campsites and over foraging areas, that group solidarity and otherness of the other side is a fundamental theme. But the East-West theme is at least 2,400 years old. It's a little boring, and it's such a crude character. And when Biden came into office, of course, he's not a very intelligent person, even when he was younger. But he started, his whole foreign policy was the democracies versus the autocracies. I didn't know whether to put my thumb in my mouth and suck my thumb of how stupid this was, or how dangerous this kind of divide the world approach is. Turns out it's the latter. Biden meant it. He's absolutely dividing the world. He doesn't sit down to have conversations with anybody. We're great, they're evil. By the way, you know, your friend at Springer, China's really going to endanger American way of life? Come on, are you kidding? What are you talking about?
Is there a sense, I think, is there a sense, an identity crisis here in the West? We have this woke philosophy, that the questioning of everything, I mean, even of biology. Then you have this kind of moral absolutism, not just in foreign affairs, but also in interior affairs, cancel culture. These could be read as symptoms of a severe identity crisis, which is somehow compensated by these pictures, you know, by this kind of Dr. Strangelove way of looking at the world.
I think it's actually something a little bit different in my view, although there are many interpretations. But, you know, in 1095, Pope Urban called for the First Crusade. And this was, Europe was pretty pathetic at that stage. It was peasants as serfs on manorial farms. But the idea was the crusade against the infidel. And a reconquest of the Holy Land and all of that. And it started what was 1,000 years of Western ascendancy looking back. And the idea that the West has the dominant moral, religious philosophy that it should lead the world. And crusading became not only a literal series of wars, but it became an idea of the West, of spreading Western values, Western dominance, whatever those values were, African slavery, conquest, empire, whatever. Then, of course, the next phase was the voyages of Columbus and Vasco da Gama. And Adam Smith, writing 275 years after that, said those were the two game changers of the world, because basically it became an interconnected but Western-led world. Then with the industrialization of the 19th century, and with Darwinism, by the way, in its interpretations by social Darwinists, the idea was Europe is superior in power, it is superior in values, probably it's superior in genetics, became the new idea when the idea of evolution and genetics came at the beginning of the 20th century.
So you would say that this is kind of a superiority complex that is still raging within the West? If I
yes, but with one major fact, which is that it's so flawed so arrogant, and now we live in a multipolar world. The great trick of Protestantism was teaching people how to read. And so literacy came early to Europe's north. That was a huge economic advantage, by the way. Huge! Probably the most significant thing was the printing press and Luther saying, read the Bible on your own, and Calvin saying, read the Bible. Suddenly literacy. Okay, the rest of the world basically illiterate. One part of the world literate. And then saying, we're literate? We have advanced technology. We're superior. Oh, we're genetically superior. Oh, we're racially superior. So this became the idea. Now, all of it was a kind of cruel nonsense, even in historical terms, because the other great civilizations were, we've been here too for 3,000 years, sorry to tell you. And now we're really, truly at a moment where the United States can't get its way in Ukraine. The United States can't get its way in Taiwan. The United States can't get its way in the Middle East. The Arabs have woken up, by the way. They've been manipulated by the British Empire and by the French and by the American Empire for 100 years. They're saying, stop, no more, don't manipulate us. So what's happening is 1,000 years, or you could say since Herodotus, but basically 1,000 or 500 or 200 years, depending on when you want to date it, of perceived European superiority. What your counterpart Springer said, Western values. That's not just we have our values, that's our superiority is what's being expressed there. This is being challenged, understandably, properly, by the fact that there are other people in the world. Thank you. And when I add up the vote count, as it were, the US has 335 million people. European Union has 450 million people. Add in Switzerland, add in Norway, add in Britain, and you get maybe to 900 million people. Add in, if you want, though it's kind of arbitrary, Japan, Korea. Add in Australia, New Zealand. Maybe you get to 1 billion people. That's 12.5% of the world population. We're going to run the world? Come on. I'm an economist. I'm not a conservation biologist or a specialist in your topic of integrative conservation. But I am working with the United Nations actively every day to try to implement the globally agreed goals that we have set for sustainable development. So I'm constantly wondering about and worrying about how we can actually achieve what we have set out to achieve. Now, the basic problem is that our institutional framework, our politics and our economic institutions are not aligned with sustainable development. They are not aligned with conservation. They are not aligned with stabilizing the climate. They are not aligned with protecting biodiversity. So we are in the middle of a crisis. The crisis has been underway for many decades. It's already more than 30 years since the world governments adopted 3 major environmental agreements. The first on climate change, the UNFCCC, or the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. The second, the Convention on Biological Diversity. And the third, the UN Convention to Combat Desertification. And these were adopted back in the Rio Earth Summit in 1992. We are more than 30 years later, and not one of these treaties is actually being implemented successfully. The reasons are complex, but the basic problem is that the international market economy and our geopolitical environment, the way that governments interact, does not lead to success so far. Time is also very short. because when we're dealing with biological conservation or climate change, it's not only a matter of delay, it's a matter of irreversibilities that we are facing. If we drive species to extinction, as far as we know, we're not going to recover them. If we exceed climate limits, we are not easily going to recover a safe climate. In both circumstances of ecosystem functioning and of the climate, and they're obviously related, we believe that there are tipping points beyond which we experience highly dangerous feedback effects and runaway effects that become irreversible. So when I say that we have lost time during the last 30 years, it's not merely that we have delayed the introduction of effective measures. We have also come closer to major irreversibilities. In the case of biological diversity, these irreversibilities include species extinction and the collapse of ecosystem functioning. When it comes to climate change, last year was 1.48 degrees Celsius above the pre-industrial level. In other words, we have already reached the 1.5 degrees Celsius limit that was set in the Paris Agreement in 2015 to implement the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. We will probably exceed the 1.5 degrees limit in 2024. Now, partly this is because of a short-term or interannual effect of El Nino, but the underlying upward trend of global warming has definitely accelerated. And we are now at a warming rate of about 0.3 degrees Celsius per decade. So we're going to overshoot the 1.5 degrees, perhaps very seriously. And that could lead to irreversible disasters. The destruction of the ice sheets, or at least part of the ice sheets of Antarctica and Greenland, the slowing or even stopping of the ocean circulation, the thermohaline circulation, the melting of permafrost, and the massive release of methane and CO2 buried beneath the permafrost, and of course the loss of species that cannot migrate successfully in the context of a warming climate and which reach thermal limits beyond which they can't survive. And that's true of both plants and animals, and many alpine species which have been climbing up the mountainsides, but the mountains have peaks, and beyond that, the warming will lead to the destruction of the habitat of these species. In general, the world market economy does not send the right signals either for climate change or for biodiversity conservation. Markets do not incorporate the losses of natural capital in any direct way. These are, from an economic theory point of view, external effects that are not captured by market forces. And as much as we have discussed for the last 40 years, actually, these external effects, we have not succeeded in internalizing them or bringing them under control. Now, when it comes to biological diversity, I would say the challenge is even more complicated than the climate challenge. When it comes to the climate challenge, which includes the land use regulations, there is at least a pathway that can be identified for how the world's energy systems can be transformed in order to stop the CO2 emissions related to fossil fuel use, and when it comes to the other greenhouse gases, methane and nitrous oxide, at least a sketch of what needs to be done. When it comes to biological diversity, I would say that every biome, every ecosystem, every local land use environment presents its own challenges, which are very complex, which do not lend themselves to easy market-based solutions where one simply adjusts a market price, for example, and thereby creates an incentive that leads to the right outcomes. Because when we're talking about biological diversity, it's very hard to put a price on biological diversity. We don't easily correct the market failures that lead to the destruction of species and lead to the destruction of the functioning of the ecosystems. So when it comes to what to do, the challenges of biological conservation are extraordinarily complex. They cannot easily be summarized in the way that the climate agenda can be summarized. With the climate agenda, well, even there, of course, it's complex, but with the climate agenda, we say things like decarbonize the energy system by 2050, or reach net zero emissions by 2050. When we discuss the same issues with regard to biological diversity, we say protect a certain amount of land area, or stop or slow the destruction of habitat, or the extinction rates, and so on. But these are goals that are not easily turned into policies with effect. And so my own observation of these processes that I've been involved in a diplomatic level for the last 25 years on a daily basis is that both the climate agenda and the biodiversity agenda are complicated, but I would say the biodiversity agenda is even more complicated and less successful in terms of any kind of public awareness, set of policies, or measures of implementation. I think it's right to say we are on a path that is designed typically in the relevant species, or the number of members of species. So the species abundance is in decline, whether it's fisheries or whether it's forests, or whether it's different classes of species, amphibians or pollinators or other groups. And we do not have effective mechanisms to address this decline that are actually working and operational. So what to do? My own approach, which I advocate for all issues, and I should say that when it comes to sustainable development, we're talking about not only the environmental crises, but also the social crises, the economic crises, the problems of extreme poverty. We have 17 SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals, after all. We have the climate crisis and so forth. My own view is that we need much more detailed specification of our objectives, of the ways to achieve them, and of their incorporation into national plans on a scientific basis. And then the identification of the policy instruments, whether it is economic incentives, regulation, land use, protected areas, and so forth, for how the scientifically specified objectives can be achieved, and then a systematic and frequent monitoring mechanism so that we are not simply meeting every 5 or 10 years to understand how bad things are going, but actually reporting almost in real time using extensive satellite data and ground truthing data so that we have a rapid feedback of data to confirm or disconfirm whether we are on the right track, and to enable not only monitoring and understanding the state of affairs, but also enforcement mechanisms that typically mean enforcement against illegal actions like illegal fishing or illegal clearing of forests or illegal use of scarce fresh water supplies and so forth. So planning, incentive structures, and monitoring mechanisms are all essential. I know that in a sense this exists in the area of biological diversity because the Kunming-Montreal Protocol is supposed to do this, but it is extremely weak. I can go an entire year without hearing one policymaker or one ambassador or one finance minister even mention the Convention on Biological Diversity, much less discuss how it is being enforced or implemented or incentivized. I hear almost nothing about this agenda at the UN or among policy makers. So you are the scientists and the experts, but I can tell you it is not in the active domain of the policy community. Now, I do also need to stress that even the climate agenda, which is much more visible, is also not being implemented because, well, it raises a number of questions, which I'll mention briefly. But the biodiversity agenda is way down on the list of awareness, of priority, of budgets, and of specific mechanisms for implementation. And it's more complicated because there aren't simple rules of what to do. These policies need to be implemented with a tremendous local knowledge everywhere. So only local ecologists can save their own local ecosystems because outsiders don't know, don't care, and are not in a position to set policies and plans for success. One more basic point that I want to emphasize, and then I'll talk about a couple of the obstacles, and then we can open it up for discussion. Whether it is the climate agenda or whether it is the biodiversity agenda, regional cooperation between neighboring countries is typically essential. And everything that I've said about how hard this is involves another level of difficulty, which is active cooperation among neighboring countries. Governments do not work very well together in a detailed way on just about anything. But in the areas of shared biomes, a shared river system, a shared forestry, a shared fisheries, cooperation sometimes exists on paper, but in practice, it's quite limited. Usually in a rivershed, the upstream countries do what they want, and the downstream countries try to adjust to the consequences. When it comes to fisheries, the illegal fishing is pervasive. Fleets come in and they hope to avoid detection. They catch the fish and they leave. But enforcement is very weak. When it comes to shared forest regions, it is very hard to get agreements on a shared forest biome to limit deforestation or logging especially of highly valued tropical forest products. And so regional cooperation is both vital and difficult. This is true also in the climate area on energy transformation. In general, a low carbon energy system requires interconnections across national borders because when it comes to intermittent energy sources like wind, solar, and hydro, it's better to connect those in a large grid to reduce the variability by smoothing across a number of different sources rather than having one country at a time make its own energy system. But getting that kind of regional grid requires a lot of political trust, a lot of market organization, a lot of shared regulation, and so on. All of this is made complicated by our geopolitical environment. The United States is a very bad behavior, in my view, right now. The US government is more interested in its power, its military advantage, its dominance, than it is in sustainable development. I almost never hear a constructive word coming out of Washington about these topics. The only thing Washington is interested in is war, the military, and competition with China and competition with Russia. And this is all extremely short-sighted and dangerous and nasty, I have to say. So the geopolitical environment is also extremely difficult. Now, finally, let me just say what a world should be doing. And when it comes to land use and biodiversity, let me emphasize a very basic point, which you know, which is that sustainable management of ecosystems is critical both for the climate goals as well as for the biodiversity goals, because around 1/3 of all of the greenhouse gas emissions come from land use change, deforestation, and unsustainable forms of agriculture. And so this means that if we're going to address the climate agenda, we intrinsically need to address the conservation agenda. We need to stop deforestation. We need to protect the ecosystem functions because they not only contribute directly to the biodiversity objectives, but they also contribute to the climate objectives. And of course, they're fundamental for many other objectives as well, for public health, for example, for access to safe water supplies, and so on. So this agenda of sustainable land use, conservation, and ecosystem protection is a pervasive objective, but it is a difficult one. It's difficult scientifically, and it's very difficult to implement. The first thing that I have always wanted to see is a rigorous approach to land use planning that satisfies the needs of biological diversity conservation. My guru was the wonderful scientist Edward Wilson, who was a teacher of mine and a friend and a colleague. And he said, protect half the earth. And I always wanted to know which half. Where do we draw the lines? How do we determine this? For each country, can we show on a map where agriculture and cities can be and where the protected areas should be designated? I want the scientists to help us understand this. This obviously intersects very closely with the agriculture challenges. So ecologists and agronomists need to be working intimately together, because the biggest challenge to biodiversity is probably the agriculture sector. It's the extension of farmlands, croplands, pasture lands. It's the drainage of water for irrigation. Agriculture is the great driver of land use change and of unsustainability and biodiversity loss. And yet the agronomists and the conservationists tend to view each other as enemies rather than as colleagues for how to actually draw the right maps to say, here's what can be done here, and here's what should not be done here. Now, suppose we had an ideal map of the world that identified where the reserves should be, where agriculture should be under different conditions, how the rivershed should be used, how the fisheries should be controlled, and so forth. Suppose we knew that by the magic of ecological sciences, we would then face the question, how could such a vision actually be implemented? Because it would not be consistent with market forces. Market forces would say, chop down those trees and grow palm oil, deforest and open up more pasture land, and so forth. So the incentive questions become very crucial. Once we know what to protect, then we need a structure how to protect them. Let me just observe that we do not have even a basic incentive structure for conservation almost anywhere in the world. There is almost no active valuation of ecosystem services. There is no funding to keep forests standing. There is very little enforcement of mechanisms like tradable quotas for fisheries. Forests are routinely chopped down, even when they are designated as reserved areas, because illegal logging is quite profitable typically. I was taken a few years ago in Borneo, in Kalimantan, to a protected region, and all I saw for 50 kilometers was trucks carrying out giant tropical logwoods on their way to the Chinese market. So it was completely being deforested, but in name, it was a protected area. So we need incentive structures and enforcement structures that don't exist. There are basically, there are several kinds of tools that in principle could be used. We could be paying communities to protect the nature, even paying indigenous communities, for example, to be active stewards and guardians of their ecosystems. We could be paying to keep land areas intact rather than utilized. But the funding for that barely exists at the international level in any scale. So we have demonstration projects, small scale projects, but we don't have anything like the scale of resources that would be needed for this kind of protection. Another kind of regulation is to enforce rules of sustainability within global supply chains. So a buyer of tropical logwoods would have to certify that the source of those logs is a sustainable source, or the purchaser of soybeans from Brazil would have to certify that the soybeans did not come from a deforested margin of the Amazon, and so forth. And Europe is trying to introduce such supply chain rules. They're very rudimentary, and most of the supply side countries, whether it's the Southeast Asian countries that provide palm oil, or whether it is the South American countries that provide feed grains and meat products, resist this kind of regulation. They don't want it, they don't like it. And so really implementing this kind of sustainable supply chain rule, I think, is promising, but very difficult. Then comes the enforcement issue. Almost any of these mechanisms is subject to cheating and subject to illegal activities. And in order to enforce such agreements, there needs to be policing, and there needs to be very active monitoring. I think one of the most important good points is that with satellite data, we can have daily monitoring. In fact, we can create real-time data on where deforestation is taking place or where ships are where they should not be in fishery zones and so on. So we have the capacity for monitoring that is much, much greater than it was ever before, because it can be done remotely and digitally. But still, we haven't implemented such systems in a detailed way. So maybe I'll pause here just to say we're running out of time. We need the scientists to say, here is what to do. Here are the rules that could actually be put in place. Then economists like myself can probably help by coming along and saying, here are incentive structures or regulations or financial mechanisms that can help to enforce what you, the conservation biologists, have identified as the substantive need in order to achieve the conservation goals that the world has set. Then, of course, we have the ultimate issue of trying to get the attention of our governments. For me in the United States, this is especially hard because my government is especially nasty, I would say, incompetent and corrupt. And so it's rather difficult to get their attention because they're much more interested in war than they are in peace. And they're much more interested in unilateralism than they are in cooperation. But we have to try. So this is maybe where I'll stop and turn it back over to you for discussion.
On April 13th, Iran launched more than 300 drones and missiles towards Israel following a deadly Israeli attack on the Iranian consulate in Damascus. It's the first time Iran has directly attacked Israel, while Israel is weighing how it's going to respond to Iran's attack. And global leaders at the same time are saying, hey, you need some restraint here. The U.S. said that it wants to see these tensions de-escalate and that it wouldn't join Israel in any military retaliation against Iran. Question for me is the U.S. doing enough, though, to restrain Israel?
Probably not at some level. I think Israel will do something. It won't be helpful to anything. Israel started this round of escalation with the attack on the diplomatic compound in Damascus. Pretty brazen. I'd say more than pretty brazen, very brazen. Rather illegal, contrary to the Geneva Conventions on attacking diplomatic sites, a clear escalation, and I think clearly intended to pull the U.S. Into a war with Iran, which is probably Netanyahu's dream. I don't think that's going to work. It's a terrible idea, terrible for Israel, terrible for the United States.
And the U.S. has been pretty unequivocal about that. Biden said, we're not getting pulled into a military war.
Right, and Netanyahu seems to think that he really runs the U.S. government, and sometimes it feels
not always
that way.
wrong. Yeah.
Exactly, sometimes it feels that way. So he doesn't take Biden at face value in that sense. He thinks he can manipulate things or force the hand of the United States or get the U.S. to come meekly behind what Israel says, because after all, the U.S. keeps saying no red lines, ironclad commitment, and all the rest. But it's been clear this is not what the U.S. should do and what it wants to do. But Netanyahu is provoking. I do think, again, though there are some serious uncertainties about what really happened with the Iranian attack, it seems more likely than not that there was some pretty bad news for Israel in that several apparently hypersonic missiles got through and hit their targets. That's got to be absolutely alarming for Israel. So I think purely on a military calculation, this was not a good week for Israel.
And also in terms of the perception of Israel, prior to October 7th, there was an idea that they were almost impenetrable, at least at home. And now the fact that Hamas was able to sort of successfully breach the borders, the fact that, we see things going on all around the globe that makes Israel look weak, does that provoke Israel to engage in more aggressive activity?
Well, I think it has deeply called into question the strategy and the tactics of this particular cabinet. This is an extremist, nationalist Israeli cabinet, the most extremist in history. It does believe in a greater Israel. It does believe in permanent apartheid or worse, ethnic cleansing, or whatever is needed for Israel to keep its control and to prevent a Palestinian state. And what is happening is that fundamentally the world does not support that agenda. The world, even the United States, and I would say the American public, is pretty aghast at what they've seen. And even the political class in the U.S., which is absolutely, typically 100% behind Israel, is shocked and not going down that line. So Israel's got itself into a terrible mess because of its extremism, doesn't know what to do. Netanyahu's normal modus operandi is when you're in a mess, escalate. And that, I think, is still probably odds on to what they'll try to do.
The U.S. has historically taken a very aggressive stance toward Iran, including pulling out of the Iran deal in 2018. For decades, they've imposed economic sanctions under multiple presidents, with more announced after the attack over the weekend. The U.S. has also allied with Israel and Arab countries like the UAE, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, all against Iran. Has U.S. policy in the Middle East enabled the possibility of a wider war?
Well, I think the first point, the most decisive thing that's happened vis-a-vis Iran is that Iran and the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia have had a rapprochement. They're going to be together, it seems, in the BRICS, in this enlarged grouping, although with Saudi Arabia it's not 100% clear that that's the case. But definitely there has been a diplomatic reconciliation of sorts. Israel's war in Gaza, which has been so much more shocking and devastating than people would have imagined, have really pushed Iran and the Arab world closer together, not farther apart, despite what Israel hopes and what U.S. strategy has been. So I don't think that the U.S. And Israel can maintain any kind of coalition with the major Arab countries against Iran at this moment. Israel is making that absolutely impossible because of Israel's extremism. That puts the U.S. On the back foot vis-a-vis China, for example, which has been diplomatically extremely successful in the Middle East. It was interesting in the UN Security Council session after the Iranian attack, you also heard, even from an American ally as close as Korea, some words of caution against Israel that you would not normally have heard. Korea depends on the Middle East for its energy. It does not want this thing to explode. So I think at the core of this is a failed Israeli political strategy.
Not a failed U.S. Middle East policy over decades.
Well, more fundamentally, absolutely, the U.S. has enabled a failed Israeli strategy, a terrible one. So I do completely agree that that the U.S. policy in the Middle East is failing terribly. It's leading to wider war. Even if the U.S. wants to restrain that, it's not restraining the wider war. Why? because at the crux of this conflict is an unsolved political problem with Israel and Palestine that absolutely needs to be solved. And all of the anti-Iranian dimensions have a very large source in the Palestine-Israel conflict, after all. There's no intrinsic reason why Iran would be the great enemy of the United States. Even with all the history, the U.S. has a lot to apologize for to Iran, starting in 1953 with the overthrow of the democratic government and the installation of a police state, after all. So there could have been a rapprochement between the U.S. and Iran. I've always wanted that. I thought the U.S. should have signed the JCPOA and implemented it. And of course, that was subverted by Trump. Biden was weak, as he has been in so many areas, of not bringing that back to life. Biden has been weak in allowing Netanyahu to continue his extremist agenda. And here we are with massive failures building up, not just in the Middle East, but we have crises all over the world. And I would say it's because U.S. foreign policy is out of date, outmoded, and with weak leadership.
You talked about this sort of enduring problem in the Middle East, specifically in Israel-Palestine. There's been a lot of renewed interest in Israel-Palestine, specifically around the so-called two-state solution.
Yes.
The U.S. has always said they've supported the two-state solution, whatever that might mean to them. And they have always articulated that as a kind of pathway toward Palestinian statehood. They want Israel and Palestine to negotiate directly in this regard. That's been a U.S. position. You know, I'm not sure how viable or possible that is.
Well, you know, my thought is, okay, yeah, there have been negotiations now for decades. We're done with that phase. Now we implement the two-state solution.
Right.
It's been clear all the way back to the Six-Day War in 1967 what the outcome has to be, which is a state of Palestine on the pre-war borders and a state of Israel, and they're living side by side. They may not like each other. Maybe there's a barrier between them, but there are two states. And this has been clear for 57 years. The U.S. has said...
Let me push back on that for two reasons. One, there seems to be a growing sense in the global community, and certainly among Palestinian civil society, that the two-state solution is actually not only undesirable, but non-viable.
Right.
Because of settlement expansion, because of Israel's refusal to stand down on this claim of greater Israel, all of it is ours. That really there's a one-state reality that can only be repaired with a one-state solution, a single secular democratic state.
Yeah, I think that right now there's an overwhelming sentiment in the world to implement the two-state solution, which has been on the table and is embodied in probably dozens of UN General Assembly and Security Council resolutions over many, many decades. On both sides of this divide, which is a terrible, brutal divide, there is a one-state solution. Of course, many in Palestine say one state, Palestinian majority, and that's it. On the Israeli side, we know this current government is for one state, completely an Israel-dominated state. My view is that, practically speaking, these two sides do not get along, and there maybe in future generations, someday they will get along. But for the moment, the right answer is the one that has been embodied in resolution after resolution, but never enforced. And I agree, we're coming to the end of that road. The UN Security Council is getting ready for a vote on Palestinian membership in the UN based on the two-state solution.
What does that mean? Talk to me about what that means as a practical matter. Perhaps recognition of Palestine as a state, membership
that would be
status.
phenomenal.
It'd be phenomenal. But you still have Netanyahu who's saying, perhaps as a pretext, but that post-October 7th, we can't even have a conversation about a two-state solution, that a permanent, durable solution has to include Israel having security control over Gaza and over the West Bank. If that's the case, then is this all just for nothing?
No, because I don't think Netanyahu has the final word in this. I think the world community has the final word. And if we find, as I believe to be the case, that there's an absolutely overwhelming global sentiment, this war has to stop. Israel has to stop killing the people of Gaza. The two sides do not have to trust each other, love each other, like each other, even tolerate each other, but they have to coexist side by side without the killing. I think that this means saying to Netanyahu and this extremist government, if you can't implement that, it's going to be a different one onward, but this is the will of the international community under the UN Charter. And that, I believe...
Israel doesn't find the UN Charter very persuasive.
Yes, but Israel depends entirely on the U.S. backing to repudiate the UN Charter.
So that's the point that
Yes.
I want to drill down
Yes.
on a little bit. It seems to me that it's far more important for the United States to assert its power than for the international community. Israel says, hey, ICJ, we don't care. ICC,
correct.
we don't care. Geneva Convention's not so important. But if Biden makes that call and says, hey, no more money, hey, no more vetoes.
I would put even more explicitly, just no more bombs.
Fair enough.
You can't fight tomorrow without our munitions,
Yeah.
which is literally the case. So I think that's right. The U.S. will not do that just on its own by saying, oh, it would be nice to have a two-state solution. It will not do that. On the other hand, if the overwhelming global majority says that's the right way, then the U.S. has a different choice.
Hasn't that always been the case? I mean, for the last few decades, hasn't the global community effectively spoken out against the settlements in the West Bank, effectively said that funding for Israel should be conditional upon human rights abuses going away, but we still see the siege in Gaza?
Yes.
The international community hasn't been unclear about this.
No, I agree. It has not been unclear, and the U.S. has been temporizing, protecting Israel, and delaying up until now. Now we have, I believe, a genocide underway. I think it is absolutely a disaster, and I think the world community is more alarmed and more shocked and more saying, if we are anything as a world community, we have to implement what we've said. An example, the vote on membership is a vote that should have happened 13 years ago.
Absolutely.
Because this was an application by the Palestinian Authority in 2011 for membership. When you make that application, it goes to an admissions committee, new members committee, which is constituted by the UN Security Council. They did all the work. They said Palestine qualifies. The U.S. blocked it. And the U.S. blocked it saying, it's not quite right now, not quite time, but take observer status. That's pretty good, and soon enough you'll be a member. Now we're 13 years later. There is a genocide underway in Gaza. There is the risk of a wider war. It's true. You could say, well, Mr. Sachs, wasn't all of this true 13 years ago? I would say, yes, it was true 13 years ago. But 13 years later, the dangers to the whole world are much greater, and the prevarications of the United States are so much more evident as well. So to my mind, I want to give another push. Okay, United States, you said back in 2011, it's going to happen quickly. We're farther and farther away because you have backed something that is against international law. You have sided repeatedly on the ground with Israel, even though it's direct violation of the UN Security Council resolutions. I want to push so that we actually live like responsible grown-ups, saying what we say, we do. We have international law, we apply it. And I think this is a moment, if again it fails and fails, well, you're absolutely right. This will go down in history as A, a disaster, and B, as a long period of hypocrisy of shocking dimension, and C, somebody will have to come up in the next generation with different answers. But right now we have an answer that is viable, workable, practicable, and the question is for the United States, are you going to apply what the whole world says is needed and what the U.S. itself says is needed, or are you going to continue to fake it? My basic argument to the U.S. is it's no good for the U.S., but it's also no good for Israel. Israel's legitimacy is shot by all of this. You go around the world, as I do all the time, people are aghast at what Israel is doing, and
young people around the world are saying, what the heck is this? This kind of government has no legitimacy at all. And so Israel needs to change for its own survival. That's my own view.
That's an interesting question that you raise. Is it time for Biden and maybe other U.S. politicians to change course? I mean, there's a way that Biden is simply following the course that every presidential candidate has followed. You stand with Israel. There's no daylight.
That's it.
There's nothing between us. But now there's a generation of voters that are looking at this differently. Since Operation Cast Lead, certainly since Protective Edge, people have said, wait a minute, that's a lot of killing. That's a lot of death.
You're absolutely right. This is the first time that the American public has really focused on this in a very long time. And what they're seeing, they don't like. And the politicians are shocked.
Yeah.
Politicians don't like kind of hanging out where the public isn't.
Yeah.
But they've been so trained. A guy like Biden, I mean, this is decades, never show any daylight between Israel and you.
It's like a certain kind of fundamentalism I'm watching here.
That's the first rule.
Yeah.
Not a word, not a peep. And he's pretty much sticking to that, except for we hear the gossip of what he calls Netanyahu, et cetera, et cetera. But
the leaks. I call those press leaks.
Exactly. but on the public pronouncements, it's the old school. Now, if Biden's not old school, what is he? I mean, he's completely old school. But what's shocking for them is it doesn't play.
Yeah.
It may play with some big donors, but it's not playing with the public. And they got to worry about the public. After all, at some point, what the public thinks matters in this country, especially in a November election.
Absolutely. Talk to me about the short term. We understand the kind of long-term goals here around statehood, around kind of creating a kind of global peace. But in the short term, people are dying and people are starving. How do we get to a ceasefire right now?
The reason we don't have a ceasefire right now is actually the long term, strangely enough. There's no endpoint even agreed. That's why Israel won't even agree to a permanent ceasefire. It says maybe ceasefire for 3 weeks or 6 weeks. Hamas says, well, that just means they're going to come back and slaughter us 6 weeks from now. Why doesn't Israel agree to something longer? Because then people ask, well, what is longer? And when Israel says, well, we're in control, no, that can't be longer. That's not an answer. So you have to have a point on the horizon where you're heading. That's why I want to clarify that by saying two-state solution, Palestine, member of the United Nations. We know where we're heading. There are a lot of details to work out in implementation, but we know where we're heading. So we're not arguing, BB, about that anymore. It's not what you care, what you say, what Smotrich says, what Ben-Gvir says about 2 states, 1 state, 3 states, greater Israel. That's done. The world's spoken. We know where we're going. Now we have to stop the fighting. To my mind, that will become absolutely directly more clear once that direction is settled. So I see it actually that many times, if even you want to start your hike up the mountain, you have to know where we're heading so you know what path you're going to follow. Once Palestine is voted in, I hope this week, really hope the United States does not block this again, because it would block it standing against the entire world.
That may be political
community.
Suicide for Biden.
I think it would be. And so I'm hoping they have enough sense. Of course, these advisors need to recalibrate everything that they ever learned in politics, but they need to get this right. Then, okay, what's the point of the war anymore? Because now we have Palestine entering the UN. By the way, the clause is as a peace-loving nation. You have to accept the UN Charter. You enter as a peace-loving nation. That actually means something. It means that all of the countries in the region are oriented towards Israel's security as well as the Palestinian state security. So everybody has to take practical steps as soon as that happens. The Saudis, UAE, Qatar, Egypt, Jordan, and Israel and the United States, all the rest. Okay, we have to stop the arms flows. We have to stop the killing. We have to start with the emergency services once again. We have probably 1 million people on the brink of starvation right now, so there needs to be massive, massive infusions of emergency food aid. Of course, this could start immediately if there is a political framework. There is not going to be a political framework on a process in which it's surely not this Israeli government, but I don't think any Israeli government in the near future is going to, quote, negotiate this. But the world can say, this is international law, this is how it's going to be. Stop your dreams of greater Israel. We're moving to the two-state solution.
To that point, I'm going to ask you to pull out your crystal ball for a moment. If the global pressure mounts the way you're describing, do you see U.S.-Israel relations changing? Do you see U.S. policy toward Israel fundamentally shifting?
Fundamentally, it has to shift because it can't give a blank check. The current policy is, Israel, you tell us what you want, we stand with you ironclad and ship the money your way. That's an impossible policy. All you do if you're a big power like the United States and you tell another country that's dependent on you, you choose everything. All you do is invite the craziest kind of extremism, because they say, we got the U.S., we manipulate the U.S. Bibi thinks he runs the U.S. And as we said, he's got some evidence on his side up until now. The U.S. has to put some clear markers on this. We have a policy. We don't want to divide with the rest of the world. We don't want it to be two countries, Israel and the United States, against the other 191 countries. We have some basic standards based on the UN Charter. Once Israel hears that, things will change, but that's a big change from now, because the current policy is, Israel, you tell us what you need or what you want, we back you.
Well, actually, there have been 3 major negotiations in Ukraine that should be mentioned. The first one goes back to 1990. Just before the Soviet Union itself disbanded. The first negotiation was between Gorbachev and President Bush on the end of the Cold War. And Gorbachev said, we will disband our military alliance, the so-called Warsaw Pact. And the United States said, we will not take advantage of that. You allow Germany to be unified, reunified, and we will not take advantage of that. And specifically, the famous pledge was, NATO will not move 1 inch eastward.
Yes.
And this pledge was made solemnly and repeatedly. There's a wonderful archive of materials demonstrating this, put together by George Washington University, the National Security Archive Project. And it shows that this is the way that the Cold War ended, through negotiation. As soon as the Soviet Union dissolved in December 1991, the U.S. reneged. But Russia was the successor state, even in law called the continuation state. What was said to the Soviet Union needed to apply to Russia. But as soon as the Soviet Union dissolved, the American strategists in the Defense Department in 1992 under Cheney and Wolfowitz and Rumsfeld started the plan for a unipolar US-led world, or sometimes called hegemony, or sometimes called full spectrum dominance. And the idea there was that NATO would enlarge at will. That's the first negotiation. Second negotiation I would mention was in 2008, the US, which had already pursued NATO enlargement repeatedly against promises, already NATO had expanded to 10 more countries, actually, to Poland, Hungary, Czech Republic, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Bulgaria, Romania, Slovakia, and Slovenia. By 2008, the US said, now we go to Ukraine. And the Russians said, no, you don't. That's our border. No, you don't. And the US said, yes, we do. And the Europeans were kind of aghast, but George W. Bush Jr. pushed it through the 2008 NATO Bucharest summit. Fast forward 2 years, Ukraine elected a president, Viktor Yanukovych, who said neutrality. We don't want to be one side or the other because we're literally geographically in between West and East. We're in the middle between Russia and NATO. We don't want to be crushed. So he said neutrality, please. The US could not accept neutrality. They participated in the violent overthrow of Yanukovych in February 2014. Second negotiation ensued, which was violence broke out after the coup. The coup itself was violent, but then a war in the Donbass broke out when the Russian ethnic provinces said, we don't want to be under a Western Ukrainian extreme nationalist group that took power by a violent coup. We want autonomy. What happened was a second negotiation called the Minsk agreements. There was a short-lived Minsk I agreement, and then it was followed by the Minsk II agreement, which was endorsed by the UN Security Council. This was diplomacy. France and Germany said, we will be guarantors of the Minsk agreement under something called the Normandy framework. You know what the United States said? Told the Ukrainians, you don't have to do that. We got your back. We're going to arm you. You don't need to give autonomy to the Donbass. You don't have to really apply the Minsk II, even though all these countries have said yes. And Merkel, Chancellor Merkel, said, actually in a shocking interview, very cynical, a couple of years ago, yes, we knew it was just it was just biding time. We didn't really mean it. Okay, that was the second. In December 2021, just before Russia invaded in what it calls its special military operation, President Putin put on the table a draft security agreement between the U.S. and Russia. I called the White House to urge the U.S. government negotiate on this. Not every word is right, but the basic idea that Ukraine will be neutral is to our advantage, Ukraine's advantage, and right there in front of us for the whole world to adopt and back. I was told, no, we're not going to give Ukraine's right to join NATO. I said, you're going to go to war. Why do you want to have a war? No, we're not going to have a war. We're going to have diplomacy. I do not admire these people because I don't think their judgment is sound. What happened, the war started. 1 month into the war, Robert, Ukraine said, okay, we can be neutral. Zelensky said it within days of the February 24th invasion. We can be neutral. The Turks said, we'll mediate. And in Ankara, negotiations began. They moved forward very rapidly. I went to Ankara, actually, to speak to the Turkish negotiators. This was moving towards an agreement. The United States and UK intervened, told the Ukrainians, fight on. You don't have to compromise. You don't have to accept no NATO membership. Fight on. We've got your back. That was about 500,000 deaths ago in Ukraine.
Right.
I had a meeting in the Vatican in the spring of 2022. We brought in a lot of diplomats and talked about the case for peace, and had huge opposition, by the way, from the Ukrainian representative, the Ukrainian ambassador to the Vatican, and so forth. It wasn't an official Vatican meeting. It was hosting a brainstorming on negotiation. Well, the US government objected. The Ukrainian government objected. They didn't want negotiations. They were going to win the war. They were going to defeat Russia. Those of us who know something about Russia said, I don't think so. This is for Russia existential. this NATO issue, they're not going to just say, oh, okay, go ahead, put in your military bases. They're not going to say that. It's going to, if things went badly for Russia, would escalate to nuclear war. Absolutely. Yeah. So this is my point. We've had a negotiation possibility for more than 30 years. So you asked me, what would it take now? One phone call from President Biden to President Putin that says, you know what, Vladimir, you're right. We're not going to expand NATO. You got to stop the war. You got to get out. We got to end this thing. We're not going to expand NATO. That was a terrible idea. Then what would ensue is some nitty-gritty negotiations. What would the boundaries be? What would the land be? What happens to Crimea? What happens to the Donbass and so forth after these years of war? But peace would come because the motivating factor of this war has been the attempt to expand NATO. To this moment, it remains the declared objective of the United States, and it remains the declared utter red line of Russia. So you have two nuclear superpowers with diametrically opposed ideas, and that is why the world is so fundamentally dangerous.
Well, it was good to hear that summary of the three attempts to make a negotiation all the way back to the fall of the Soviet Union. That was a time when you yourself were visiting Moscow and you were working with the leadership in the Kremlin. It's why it's interesting to talk with you, because you've had that experience. Then the 2008 and then later beyond 2014 attempts to negotiate in some form or another the relationship of Ukraine to NATO and relationship to Russia. And then finally, the third time in the spring of 2022, when I didn't realize you had actually flown to Ankara and sort of been on the edges of that negotiation.
Yeah, just to be clear about that, I came just after they ended because I wanted to know, why did they end? So I got a complete briefing from the Turkish negotiators. It was very disheartening.
Okay. And so we've gotten 2 years of war. The feelings of everyone are terribly bloodied by the sense of thousands, hundreds of thousands of deaths. There's the idea of not giving up a single inch of Ukrainian territory. And the Russians are looking at it past the Ukrainians toward the Americans and the other supporters of Ukraine. So you haven't really suggested that there is a real possibility, except for a phone call from Biden, of any kind of a peace process being launched. So when you hear Pope Francis, or when Pope Francis asks his Cardinal Matteo Zuppi, who's the Archbishop of Bologna, is a member of the Sant'Egidio community, and he's traveled on behalf of the Pope to Moscow, to Washington, to Kiev, even to Beijing. Do you think this Vatican effort is a helpful one? Does there seem to you any possibility that a non-aligned church party like the Vatican or like Pope Francis could play any useful role?
Of course. First, the church has a basic proposition that peace is the common good, and that the way to peace is through ethics of statecraft and through direct encounter. So the ethics of statecraft is the text of Pacem in Terris in 1963, and Pope John the 23rd issued this marvelous encyclical after the Cuban Missile Crisis that became a major spur to the partial nuclear test ban treaty reached between the US and the Soviet Union in the summer of 1963. Then I would say, in pairing with Pacem in Terris is Fratelli Tutti, because Fratelli Tutti, Pope Francis's major encyclical, is about encounter. And it starts with the story of of Francis of Assisi meeting the Sultan on the battlefield of the Fifth Crusade in Egypt. A most unbelievable but true story of
Yes.
800 years ago.
Yes.
That is absolutely the Pope's pastoral message, because Fratelli Tutti is really a pastoral message. It says if you want to reach an agreement with someone, meet them, have a dialogue with them, treat them on a human level. This is what I want between Putin and Biden, not this grandstanding. How can it be that from February 22nd, 2022 until today, 500,000 or so Ukrainians dead by now, there hasn't been one direct talk between Biden and Putin? That's unacceptable.
Right.
They need to meet. They need to talk. So this is now. Let me just mention two other points. For Russia, the core of this issue is NATO, and what Putin has wanted to hear going back to 25 years now is that NATO enlargement will stop. It's the one thing that NATO never will say until today. Even the Secretary General of NATO, Jens Stoltenberg, these days, after all of these deaths, say Ukraine will be a member of NATO. As long as he says that, Ukraine is on the path of complete destruction. So this is now one major point, which is you cannot end this war without the United States involved. I don't want to say Ukraine has no agency, because what Ukraine needs to say publicly is we will be neutral, period. That was going to end the war in March 2022. But Zelensky was talked out of it, which is completely tragic.
We do have a tragedy here. It's like a bloody mess, and everyone wants to somehow come out a victor.
Exactly.
Meanwhile, the boys are being killed.
Exactly. Everyone wants to be a victor. No one wants to just end the killing.
Yeah. And
then, by the way, Robert, just an interesting point. I mean, horrible in my view. One of the literal moments of stopping the 2022 negotiations was a visit by Boris Johnson to Kiev. Right. Boris Johnson was then the Prime Minister of the UK. Now, Boris Johnson just said recently, we can't let Russia win. That would be the end of Western hegemony. Those are exactly the words he said. What does Western hegemony mean? Western hegemony means we won. You know, it's got to be victor. We are number one. It is like playing, plant the flag or whatever, the king of the mountain when you're 8 years old. This is how they think, these people. They don't think about peace. They don't think about stopping wars. They think about their hegemony. Well, anyone that says that is way off track.
Well, I do think there were all sorts of opportunities in this past 30 years, at the start of which you were a part of the process of bringing the ex-Soviet Union, Russia, and the other countries into some type of world relationship with economically, with trade, etc. There was a possibility and the real reality of friendship, of the Bolshoi Ballet, etc., traveling. And that could have been built on, and somehow, bit by bit, after 9/11 and then forward to these recent wars, we've lost that opportunity. I think there's a historical judgment to be made that we lost a great opportunity in this period.
Yep, I agree with you.
But now we still have to say, if another 100 or 1,000 or 10,000 of Ukrainian boys and also Russian boys are going to the front, and their arms are being shot off and their legs are shot off, can't this be stopped if you fast forward in your mind to what could be a potential solution? What people would you invite And what type of solution might they possibly propose? We could call up a map also of Ukraine on the screen.
Yeah. So basically, what's terrible truth about all of this is that you see Ukraine, even the word means borderland. In Slavic, it means the border of Russia. And it's the border of the West. It's in between NATO and Russia. And it should be playing the role of a bridge. It should not be playing the role of a bulldozer, one direction or another. That's why neutrality is at the core of the solution. And there are important historical precedents about neutrality. My favorite is actually going back to 1955, when Austria, which of course was a part of Hitler's Reich in World War II and was occupied by the Soviet army after World War II, said that it would become a neutral country, not a NATO country. And on that basis, the Soviet Union picked up its troops and went home. And that was a model. It should have been a model for ending the whole Cold War, but it remains a model until today. So the first point is Ukraine should be neutral. It should have security guarantees from the UN Security Council, from other major countries, Germany and others, but it should be neutral. That means no US bases. That means no US missiles. That means no US troops on the 2,300 kilometer border with Russia, which is what Russia is existentially afraid of. Second issue is Crimea, which we see right there on the map. Crimea has been the home of Russia's naval fleet since 1783. And the idea of the West, not quite since 1783, but since 1840, has been to deprive Russia of its Black Sea naval fleet. This was the reason why Britain and France declared war on Russia in 1853 in the Crimean War.
Yes.
It was the plan of Zbigniew Brzezinski in 1997 that if we can surround Russia in the Black Sea with NATO, that means Ukraine, Romania, Bulgaria, Turkey, and Georgia, then we have defeated Russia as a great power. It's the reason why you hear so much about Crimea now, retaking Crimea. This has been a fixation of Britain since 1840. So this is wrong. Russia in 2012 negotiated with neutral Ukraine that it would have a lease on its naval base to the year 2042. A lease. But then when the overthrow came, Russia took back Crimea, saying, no, we're not going to let NATO push us out of the Black Sea. We know that's what they want, and we're not going to let it happen.
Well,
Crimea is not going to go back. Believe me, this is a bottom line.
if there's a lot of reports, we are on the 1st of May, and as we speak, and there's Putin's new term of office begins May 7th. Zelensky actually finishes a term of office on May 20th.
Yep.
There's been reports that there are even some small battalions of Ukrainians who have actually deserted on the front lines, as the pressure of the Russians is very strong, and the Western powers still have not given to the Ukraine the other reasons have prevented them from giving air support. There's reports that this entire front may collapse, and that the Russians could go forward all the way to the river there in the middle of the map.
The Dnipro, yeah.
And starting up with Kharkiv, which is the city at the top. It's not listed on this map, but it's just there in the top center. If that would happen, this would expand the war, we might say. It would raise the stakes. And if we were to look at just this particular stage, couldn't there be an opportunity here on the basis of this map to draw up some type of agreement?
Absolutely. Today, the war could end. Ukraine neutral, and if even on these on the current contact line, the Russians claim 4 regions. They claim not only the 2 Donbas regions, Donetsk and Lugansk, but also Zaporizhia region and Kherson region, which are to the southwest. They don't have full control over all of them. My own view is that on the basis of Ukrainian neutrality, you could set the territorial issues probably along the contact line right now. But that's part of what negotiation would be about,
All right.
those details. But I think your point is completely right, Robert. The longer this goes on, and with the U.S. claiming still today, NATO enlargement, Russia will continue westward, and it will take large swaths of territory that it will not give back under these circumstances. So this is not in Ukraine's favor. Now, what Ukraine says, no, arm us more, air cover, no fly zones, U.S. Western troops, and so forth. Okay,